And welcome, fans of flip clocks, to the 1970s. Here's a pop quiz. What is this? At its most basic, it's obviously a flip clock, right? To be more specific, it's a Copal Model 601 calendar flip clock, except these clocks were not called flip clocks in the 1970s. That's right, digital clocks. What are universally known as flip clocks today were called digital clocks by the manufacturers and the advertisers. So what, right? But for some reason I find it strange and interesting that these days we refer to all these clocks as flip clocks. So what I'd like to do is review the evidence that what I'm saying about flip clocks being called digital clocks is actually true. But more than that, I want to try to discover how the 70s digital clocks morphed into what we now call flip clocks. Almost without exception, these clocks of the 70s were called digital clocks. Well, because they were. The LED electronic digital clocks had yet to come. We're going to take a look at some of the 70s advertisements to get a feel for what was going on back in the day. Remember, these were the clocks to have. Here's a quick example. You can see clearly that they mark these clocks as digital clocks. On the left we have the Castellans, the Copal Castellans, which play a big part in flip clock history. Here's the Castellan 201 digital clock. Make no mistake, they're all digital clocks. Very early flip clock. And the first flip clock in Japan was the computer-age digital clock. Not a flip clock, it was a Castellan 101. But the clock that really started it all in the United States, in my opinion, was the Castellan 201. It really hit, and it really hit big back in the day. Here's an advertisement from 1966 talking about the most interesting clock you've ever seen. No mention of it being a flip clock, of course. A lot of people don't realize it started back in the late 60s. And here we are in the 70s, the Castellan digital clocks. They call them the originals because they're at a low discount price because, well, flip clocks were taken off in the 1970s. They still had entries. Copal did not shut down, of course, but they were making digital alarm clocks and digital space age and computer age clocks. It was a wild, wild world of digital clocks in the 70s, and many manufacturers jumped in. There was a big market for these clocks. They were a big deal. Now this clock here, the Sony, it's not a, I call it speedometer clock. It's not a flip clock, but they considered it a digital clock, and it's one of my favorites. You know, a digital clock radio makes sense of the morning. Big, unmistakable digits and music to soothe the waking beast. If you were a kid back then, you wanted one of these. Typically, the better off kids would get some clock like this. And you can see all kinds of makers were making these digital clocks. Sound Design, Lloyd's, Panasonic, GE. Here they mentioned that the digital clock is now a digital clock radio, so it was definitely a big deal. What Castellan started, all the other manufacturers jumped on board. And here, you know, Panasonic makes a lot of our flip clocks that we collect now, but back then they were making digital clocks, it seems. Look at this cool cat. If you were alive in the 70s, you might recognize this. That's Sammy Davis Jr. Here in 1974, he was helping General Electric advertise their audio systems. We're talking tape recorders, radios, phonographs, and of course, digital clock radios. Check out this font up here. If that's not a 70s font, that's awesome stuff. Again, where else would you find mention of these clocks being digital? Well, on the radio. Now hold on. Just a second. Yeah. No, thanks for that. That was pretty cool. But I'm talking about literally on the radio. I mean, on the radio. It is printed out here, in case you didn't know, that you were looking at a solid state FM/AM digital clock. A lot of manufacturers would throw that on the clock. Here's a Seville AM/FM digital clock radio. Big letters here. It's a digital clock. Where else might you find that these clocks were digital? In addition to being just on the radio, on the actual instructions, these are the user instructions that makes you aware that you've got a digital clock radio. And here's the Back to the Future digital clock instructions. And on the boxes themselves, in big letters here, if you were going to buy these clocks, you'd see them on the shelf and know that you had a digital clock sitting there. Again, the fact that it was digital and not analog, this was a new thing back in the 70s. If you were a technician taking these clocks apart, fixing them up, you know you're working on digital clocks. And if you had to take this clock out of here, out of this machine, please be aware that you're going to be removing a digital clock. Even Time magazine, back in '73, when it cost 50 cents. There's a full-page ad here. This awesome Panasonic. But did you ever wake up in the morning and not know what day it was? Evidently in the 70s, that was kind of a thing. Panasonic offered all kinds of digital clock radios in the 70s, as you see. And these are some clocks that we're familiar with, all digital clocks. And finally, you look here, Copal had a catalog they included with a lot of their clocks they sold. And look at these beauties. Looks like a small fortune right there. Man, wouldn't that be a collection? But these are all digital clocks. Digital calendar clock, digital alarm, digital mini alarm. Man, those are beautiful. Copal digital clocks. Awesome. So we have firmly established that these clocks were called digital clocks in the beginning, but we still don't have answers as to where the term flip clock originated. To try to figure out that, we're going to go back and look at a few early U.S. patents. An Italian inventor named Copal seems to have perfected the flip clock mechanism to what we are most familiar with today. U.S. Patent 3220174 in 1965 describes the action of the most popular clock mechanisms. From what we read here, the best Elio could come up with was describing the mechanism as a tilting plates type clock. That's not even close, Elio, not even catchy either, but hey, he was an inventor, not an advertising expert. Even as late as 1977, U.S. patents were being issued relating to flip clocks. In U.S. Patent 4005570, the flip clock is referred to as a so-called leaf-type digital clock. So-called leaf-type digital clock. Come on, say it with me. What? Flip clock. Okay, we've established that the clocks were marketed and described as digital clocks, and that the inventors called them various things, including leaf-type digital clocks. So where did the phrase flip clock come from? At this point, we're no closer to the answer. We have to keep looking. In advertising, the closest sellers got to saying flip clock was when they described their devices as having a specific type of clock mechanism. This became increasingly important as we moved into the mid-70s, as there needed to be a way to distinguish flip clocks from what we now call digital clocks. Magnavox often emphasized the type of clock. In some cases, calling it a flip digital clock, and rarely they use the phrase digital flip clock. That's close. But these phrases were unusual. More often, makers described their clocks as having a flip digital clock, or even flip leaf digital clock, or flip leaf type clock. So it was, by the 1980s, electronic LED digitals had started taking over the digital clock market, and they were the clocks to have. Because they existed side by side, it was crucial that the difference be communicated. Mom, I want a digital clock radio for Christmas, not a flip clock. kid. The name of shame has come full circle. As you all know, flip clocks are hot and now are the digital clocks owned. It is my position that consumers themselves gave these clocks their name as a way to distinguish them from electronic LEDs. The first time the name appeared in print may have been in 2000. A syndicated article from December 16, 2000 describes a Washington, D.C. museum display. This exhibit highlighted workplace offices of the past. In the article, the author mentions flip clocks. By 2005, modern clocks boldly used flip clock as part of the product name or description. The rest is flip clock history, for as you all well know, what we have here is called a flip clock. Why? Because it is what it is. Say it with me. Flip clock.
It is what it is. It is what it is.